Appreciate it. Today we're going to be talking about using PhpStorm. So we use with the development environment that we'd set up last week. This week we're going to set up PhpStorm as our IDE and doing local development environment through the IDE. Oftentimes I talk with developers and I see folks using an IDE, but oftentimes they fall into the trap of really only using it as a syntax highlighting tool. Of course, they could use almost any editor for that these days, but I'm a big proponent of using an IDE because you can do things like do your unit tests, you can do all your Docker container management, you can run debugging through it, and a lot of other things. So today we're going to set up PhpStorm so that we can do all those wonderful things as we go through and develop the sample application that we're going to be building in this series of streams. So to start with, let me go ahead and click over so that way we'll be setting up. You'll be able to view my desktop. So on my desktop, I'm going to go ahead and launch. Take my glasses off so I can see. I'm going to go ahead and launch PhpStorm. Now, I use PhpStorm through the Toolbox. You can install the Toolbox instead of installing PhpStorm by itself. With the Toolbox, you have access to all the different JetBrains editors and things like that. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that here. So I'm going to choose this first one, PhpStorm. I click on it. We can see that it is actually loading. When I close the Toolbox so it gets out of my way. And PhpStorm should be coming up. Maybe not. It says it loaded, but I don't see it anywhere. Oh, there it is. It's just delayed. CPU is a little slow with the video and everything, so bear with me on that. All right, so as it's opening up, the first thing it'll do is it'll come to the screen prompting you for either creating a project or using a past project that you had open once it comes up here. So here we go. So it says, welcome PhpStorm. And now if I had projects already open with this, I cleared them all out for the sake of this video. They would be on the left-hand side. There would be a list of the various projects that I had opened previously with PhpStorm. Now in this case, I don't have any, so I'm going to go ahead and open one. And when the open dialog box comes up, now you can also choose the second or the third item down there, which is create new project from existing files. You can also select to check out from version control, and you can use Git or Subversion or anything like that. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and open up the directory. So in projects, I created the subdirectory expressive in the previous video. So I'm going to open that. And what it's going to do is it's going to create a project in that directory for me. So that way I don't have to go through and do all that. And once that comes up, then we will have access to our project. It's also going to create a cache for searching and for the autocomplete and all that. We can see that happening down on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. And I just realized that one thing that I didn't do is alter the size of my font. So I'm going to do that first. So go into the settings while it's creating my cache. In appearance, I'm going to go ahead and select a much larger font for this. We're going to go up to, let's do 24 and see how big that is. That's pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and actually I'm going to go just a little bit smaller than that. I'm going to go step down to 22. And then in my for my editor, I'm going to click on the font there. And for the individual files, I'm going to go ahead and bump that one up as well to, let's bump that up to 20. So that way we'll have a bigger font in the editor. So you folks in the video will be able to see what I'm doing. So if I expand this out, the expressive directory, this is the project that we created in our the last episode. We see here that I have all the different files. We have the Docker Compose that we created in the last episode. And we have, of course, the composer, the way that we'd set it up. Now, the first thing that I want to do here is I want to get this set up so that I can be able to use Docker in it, because in order to do many of the other settings, like for instance, setting up the PHP unit, setting up setting up the database, and also setting up debugging, for those things to be able to be set up, we have to have a server up and running first. So we have to kick off Docker. Now, we'd created the Docker Compose in the last episode and got the Docker container up and running, and we could see it working. But now what I want to do is I want to actually use that from within PhpStorm. I want to let the IDE do the work for me. So if I click on down in the bottom left in the Docker panel and expand that out, we can see that Docker is there. It sees Docker. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click on run here, or connect rather. So it's going to connect to Docker, and it's going to tell me information down in this panel. It's going to give me information about Docker. It's going to tell me any containers that are already running. It's going to tell me any images that I already have ready for Docker to use. They're already cached. They're already local. And you'll see I have MySQL 5.7, I have PHP 7.2 with Apache, and I also have the Expressive Web latest, which is the container that was created as a result of us doing Docker Compose up in the previous episode. So I have all those here available to me. And of course I can manage that all from right here. I could remove images, I could remove containers, I can tell containers to run or stop as the case may be. So one of the things that I want to do here is that I also want to get the Docker images ready for this. If you notice, there are no containers because I've removed the containers from the last episode. So I removed the containers. Now we need to recreate those containers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the shortcut in PhpStorm. I'm going to right-click on docker-compose.xml. And when I right-click, it brings up a context menu. And one of the items there is run docker-compose.xml. So I'm going to go ahead and click that. And when I click that, it's going to start the Docker Compose. It's going to create the Docker containers for me and get those up and running. If I expand out this panel a little bit, we'll see that it did actually create the DB. It did actually create Web 1. And you can also see those in the left panel here. On the left panel, we see that we have Expressive DB and Expressive Web. We can see the logs that were output as those were created. We can even dig into the properties and see the ID of the container and the container name. We can see other environmental variables that are related to the container, and those we had created in the Docker Compose in the previous episode. We can see ports that were bound from the host to the container. In this case, we have port 8080, which then is mapped to port 80 inside the container. Now, if I open up Chrome here, give that just a second to open up. And now that the containers are launched, if I go to localhost, localhost 8080, we see that in fact it does run, and I get back my congratulations because the container is running. So therefore, I'm getting back JSON from our Zend Expressive skeleton application we installed before. So now that's up and running. Now something unique something interesting that I do want to highlight here is up in the top right. You'll notice that there's a drop down here. If you click on it, and one of the items in here, now that I right-clicked and ran that Docker Compose, is docker-compose.xml compose deployment, and that's an item now. That identifies what we just did, right? Which is we created, in the background, it created the configuration to run that. If I go to edit configurations, which I'm going to do now, the configurations open up and you can see all the specifics of what PhpStorm used to run this. Now I can rename it because that's not a very useful name. So I'm gonna shorten the name a little bit. only because I like nice short names. So I renamed it to Compose Deployment. We can see that it's using the server Docker because it picked that up from my local environment. I call my local Docker instance Docker. And you can see the compose file is in the current working directory, and it is docker-compose.xml. So it set up this configuration for us. We didn't have to worry about doing that. It created the Docker Compose configuration for us because of the way that I launched Docker Compose. So I'm going to go ahead and close that for now. So that's that. Now we have Docker actually running from within our IDE. We can manage our containers, manage our images, all from within here as they're related to our project. Now, another thing that we get out of the IDE is down here in the bottom left, next to the Docker panel tab, we also have a terminal tab. Now, this terminal actually automatically dumps us out into our current working directory. So any commands done through this terminal are done in our current working directory of Expressive. So you can see if I listed the contents of the directory and it showed us everything is there. And this is a full terminal, so I could issue any commands that I would normally use within the terminal. If I wanted to use VI, I could use VI within this tab. If I wanted to issue some other commands that I would do via a command line, I could do that within this terminal tab. So I could have easily as well just done something like docker compose up -d, which is the command that I used last week. You might remember we used docker compose up and we used the -d to make it do it daemonized, so it gave me my command line back. I could have just as easily done that here, and it would have also kicked off the items. In the background, that's exactly what PhpStorm did for us. So if I wanted to do it via command line, I could do that here. Through that terminal, or I can just, now in the future, because I have this run configuration up here that it automatically created for Docker Compose, I could just click this play button right next to that drop down and it would run that command for me automatically at the end of each time. So that's getting Docker up and running. Now, another item, now that we have our Docker containers up and running, one of the things that I also like to manage through my IDE is the database. And I do that, there's a handy database tab here. And if I click on the database tab, I expand it. Now I'm going to go ahead and minimize my Docker. I'm going to go ahead and minimize the project too. So we just have the database open and also the main viewing area. Now, I have the database container up and running, but what I've not done is I've not set it up so that container can be used throughout the application. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. One of the things I'll do is, so if I go to, I want to set up my local environment. I'm going to do that afterwards. Let me just go ahead and go forward with the database first and see. So if I click on the drop down here, it's going to add a database. If I go to data source, I can then scroll down to MySQL. I'm going to select MySQL. Sorry, my phone's going off. All right, and so by default, it's creating a beginning setting for me and getting that up and running. It's at localhost. Now, if you recall, in our container, we had set up an alternative port. I want to go ahead and open up that file. If I go to the composer YML, I want to have that open so I can see the settings. You can see the settings for the database. The settings, we set up port 6603 to map through to port 3306, and we also have some environmental variables that we set up. So we're going to want to do that in our data source here as well. So if I click that and I open up the thing, I'm going to use localhost. I'm going to change the port though to 6603 because of course I'm trying to connect to MySQL inside the container from my host machine. In order to do that, I need to use this external port that maps through, right? Now, I want to use the database name, and we of course the script that we created a DB name or the database name of DB name, and we also created the user for the database as DB user. kept it nice and simple for the sake of these tutorials. Of course, I wouldn't use those names in real life. And then, of course, we set our password, which we can see in the composer, the Docker Compose file. We set as 654321. I'm going to tell it to remember that. Now I can click on test connection here, and that's going to connect into the Docker container and connect up to the database using the credentials that I just put in there. And it comes back and says successful. And I can look at the details of that connection as well. So I'm going to go ahead and click apply because those settings work and I know I can get into the database. I'm going to click OK. And now once this screen refreshes in the panel, we'll see that I actually do have the database connection here. And I can go in and see the DB name is represented. And now if a DB name, normally it would expand out and show me the table names. It's probably not showing me that because of the connection being a little bit slow. My computer is being highly used right now between recording and running the IDE. Now I also have this window here where I could type in SQL statements if I wanted to, and I could execute them. Alternatively, I could also create an individual window for interacting with a certain database table. I'm not going to do that this time though, but now you can see how easy it is to set up the database connection. I'm going to get that panel out of the way. So we've set up Docker, we've set up the database connection to MySQL. And one of the other things that we want to do for our local environment is get PhpUnit running. So that way we can run our unit tests straight from within PhpStorm. Now, of course, we could do it via command line, but I want to set it up via PhpStorm. So now to do that, first off, I have to create the configuration file. In this project, we have a phpunit.xml.dist. I'm going to rename that file. Actually, I'm going to copy that file and I'm going to paste it. And PhpStorm will ask me what I want to name the new file to. I'm just going to take dist off of the end. So now I've got phpunit.xml. And it's a simple file. It's just saying that the test suite resides in the app directory in the tests folder. Or the namespace rather, the namespace of app/tests, and that exists in the test folder. So we've got that represented here, and then we also have other settings. It's looking for any files inside that directory, inside a subdirectory of source. So if we look in the tests folder, we'll see that there's app tests. Under that, we have handlers, and it's looking for all the tests there, and how to run. So now we have the phpunit.xml, but we can't just run phpunit out of the box like we did with Composer because PhpStorm tried to be helpful. In this case, it used our dist file because it was looking for phpunit stuff automatically. I saw that as I was starting up the IDE. Not only that, we also have to tell the IDE what our current PHP runtime is because phpunit does use PHP. So to do that, I'm going to click into the files. I'm going to go to settings. Once settings opens up, then I need to go into languages and frameworks, and we'll see that I do actually have PHP there. Now PHP currently is set to 7.1 as the default, and you'll see that there's no interpreter here. Even if I click on the drop down, it's trying to offer me my local interpreter. Well, in this case, that doesn't work for me because I want it to use the PHP that is within the containers that we're using for the development of this project. So instead, I'm going to click on the three dots out here on the right, and because I want to specify another interpreter. And I'm going to have to click, now it currently has my local one, but I want to add another one. So I'm going to click the plus, and the first item in the list that shows there is from Docker, Vagrant, VM, or Remote. It's one of the items that I can choose. So I'm going to go ahead and choose that because I'm going to be using the PHP that's inside the Docker container. I'm going to then select Docker. Now, I tried Docker Compose. I found that was a little bit troublesome because the configuration for Docker Compose, it kind of tripped over itself a little bit, but the Docker configuration works really well. So I'm going to go with that. I'm going to use this from the server. I'm going to use Docker. The image name, I'm going to choose the image name of this project. If I had other images running, of course, those would be there. But in this case, I'm going to use the Expressive Web latest, which is currently running. And then I'm going to use the PHP interpreter path, which is PHP. That's what it would use via command line. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And when I do that, it's going to create that item and add it to the list here. So not only will there be PHP 7.2 localhost, but there'll also be this new one for Docker. So we're waiting a moment while that finishes. Okay, so now we have expressive-web latest, which is our container that we're using, and everything looks good. In the general section, we can see that it did pick up the current version, PHP 7.2.13. It picked up the fact that we have Xdebug 2.6.1 inside the container, and it also picked up on the configuration. So I'm going to go ahead and click Apply to accept that, and click OK. Now in the previous tab, remember we needed to specify our CLI interpreter, and you'll notice that it does pre-populate that. The CLI interpreter is now the container, and there's also project mappings for the good location for everything. So I'm going to go ahead and apply that configuration and say OK. So now we've got our local interpreter all set for our development environment. So now I don't know how to properly run PHP and what PHP unit should be using for PHP. Now I'm gonna go ahead and right click on this and run it. Now I know it's not going to work, but it's gonna make it easier for me to then go in and customize the settings. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. Click run, and we see it comes up and tells me that it did finish, but it didn't really load correctly. And that's something that I was expecting. So we're going to go ahead and configure. Actually, I don't want to configure that. What I want to do instead is I'm going to come over here to my configurations. You'll notice that it created a new phpunit.xml configuration for me, but I'm going to go ahead and click Edit Configurations. I'm going to delete this one that PhpStorm created automatically for me, and in this one that is still there, the phpunit.xml, I'm going to go into that one. Now, one of the things that it did here is it's using an alternative configuration file, which I'm going to go ahead and configure that. And when I go into that configuration, I'm not seeing what I wanted to see. So we're going to do a little bit of troubleshooting here to see what's going on. Because it's using a local configuration. So instead, I'm going to use phpunit by remote interpreter. I need to add this extra test framework. So I'm going to add phpunit by remote interpreter. Click on that. It's saying it doesn't know what interpreter, so I have to put it in. Of course, I'm going to select Expressive Web, which is the one that we're using from the container, and click OK. Now, once I do that, it creates a new configuration, and we can see that now it's saying where the Docker container is, what that's mapped to, and it's saying the path for Composer autoloader, and we see that that is now /opt/project/vendor autoload because it's now finding it. And it can see that, in fact, there is PHPUnit 7.5.1 inside our container. So I'm going to go ahead and click Apply on that, because that is what we wanted. So now I'm using the correct interpreter for that, and click Apply here. And now I have PHPUnit selected up here. If I click play on that PHPUnit configuration, it's now going to run my tests, and we see that it did successfully run all the PHPUnit tests. And there are 5 current unit tests because the Zend skeleton, or the expressive skeleton application, comes with some tests already. And we see that 5 tests actually ran successfully with 7 assertions throughout those tests. So in all, now we've got PhpStorm ready for our local development environment. We've set up our Docker. We've set up our PHP unit so we can use that, and we're also set up so that we can use or connect to the database and run queries and things like that, even manage our database as far as the configuration and everything. So we've got all that set up. So that's all I'm going to cover this time. I hope this was helpful for you. Setting up PhpStorm for our development environment. Please check back next week, and we're going to go into the next stage, which I believe we're going to be adding some modules to the Zend Expressive application that